Somewhere in Buenos Aires tonight, someone is checking the black market price of $1 before they check the weather, because they learned long ago which one is more likely to ruin them. This is a place where a lifetime of savings has turned to paper inside a single week, where a president once lifted off the roof of his own palace by helicopter while the city banged pots in the streets below, and where the country once ran through 5 presidents in 2 weeks. The largest loan in the history of the International Monetary Fund came and went, and in the autumn of 2025, the Treasury of the United States was quietly buying pesos to hold the whole structure up. None of that is the disturbing part. Before the money died, every single time, the same 4 warning lights came on, in the same order, and the people who could read them stood up and said the worst was over. They were right that the lights were on. They were wrong about everything else. So settle in and subscribe or join if you have not, because by the end of tonight, you will be able to read those 4 lights yourself, and you will start to see them glowing on a dashboard far richer and far closer to home than this one. There is a deeper version of all this on the Patreon, where these collapses sit beside the wider story of how currencies and empires and certainties come apart. Let's start where it started. Take a 1 peso coin out of your pocket. If you are standing in Buenos Aires right now, that coin is worth almost nothing. You cannot buy a single thing with it. Not a sweet, not a match, not a minute of parking. But that 1 peso coin is the survivor of a slow execution that almost nobody outside the country quite believes the first time they hear the number. Since 1970, Argentina has removed 13 zeros from its own currency, not as a figure of speech. 13 actual zeros struck off the face of the money in 4 separate amputations, because the prices had grown so large that the banknotes could no longer be printed fast enough, counted accurately, or trusted at all. They would lop the zeros off, issue a fresh currency with a fresh name, swear that this time the new money would hold its value, and then watch the zeros come crawling back like something that could not be killed. Run the arithmetic forward and it stops being abstract and starts being frightening. That 1 peso coin in your hand is equal to 10 trillion of the pesos that Argentines were using in 1969. 10 trillion. If those 13 zeros had never been removed, the cup of coffee somebody is drinking in a cafe on Avenida Corrientes this morning would carry a price with 14 digits in front of it. The country would be quoting the cost of breakfast in numbers normally reserved for the mass of distant galaxies. And here is the part that should stop you. This was not one disaster. It was not a war, or a plague, or an asteroid, something that arrives once and never returns. Argentina did this to itself over and over, in waves, on a schedule so regular that you can almost set a clock by it. The country has collapsed, in the full sense of the word, the sense where the banks close and the savings vanish and people die in the streets, at least 3 times in the last 50 years. 1989, 2001, and the slow-motion version that began in 2018 and has not finished as I am telling you this. 3 collapses. And I want to be precise about the word collapse, because Argentina has had recessions and devaluations and bad years in between that I am not even counting. I mean the events where the entire monetary order broke, where ordinary people watched the value of everything they owned evaporate inside a single week, where the government of the day fell or nearly fell. 3 of those, spaced out across half a century. Now, the conventional way to understand an economic collapse is that it is a kind of accident, a black swan, a thing that nobody saw coming, that blindsided the experts, that could only be explained afterward by people staring at the wreckage. That is the version you absorb from the news. Crisis hits. Markets are stunned. Analysts did not predict it. That version is comforting, and it is wrong, and Argentina is the country that proves it is wrong in the most disturbing way imaginable. Because each of those 3 collapses was preceded by the exact same warning sequence. Not similar, not roughly comparable. Identical in structure, in order, in the specific shape of the signals, separated by entire decades and entirely different governments. A Peronist widow, a centrist radical, a centre-left lawyer, a centre-right businessman, a self-described anarcho-capitalist with a chainsaw. 5 wildly different leaders, 5 wildly different ideologies, and underneath all of them the same 4 lights, coming on in the same order, on the same dashboard, every single time, like a machine running a program it cannot interrupt. The first light is capital flight. Money starts leaving the country, quietly at first, the wealthy and the connected moving their savings into dollars and out through the wires before anyone else notices. The second light is the gap. A second exchange rate appears, an unofficial one, a black market rate that the people use because they no longer believe the official rate the government insists on. And the distance between those 2 numbers, the official price of $1 and the real price of $1, begins to widen. Argentines have a word for that gap. They call it the brecha, the breach. The third light is the reserves. The central bank, the institution that is supposed to defend the currency, starts burning through its hard foreign reserves to hold the line. And you can watch the number fall, week by week, toward a threshold past which there is no defence left. And the fourth light, the one that arrives last and matters most, is the denial. As the first 3 lights are blazing, as the money flees and the gap yawns and the reserves drain towards zero, the people in charge stand in front of cameras and tell the population that everything is fine, that the worst has passed, that those betting against the currency will lose. They say it with total conviction, sometimes days before the entire structure caves in on their heads. I have started calling it a dashboard, and I want to be honest that the word is a metaphor, but I think it is the right one, and here is why. When you describe these 4 signals to an Argentine, they do not react the way you or I might react to a piece of economic history. They react the way a person reacts to someone listing the symptoms of an illness they have already survived. They know the sequence in their bodies. They know that when the wealthy start moving money out, the gap will open next. And that when the gap opens, the reserves will start to go. And that when the reserves start to go, the minister will appear on television to tell everyone to stay calm. They can predict each light from the one before it. And there is something almost eerie in how reliably the sequence runs. Something that makes intelligent, unsentimental people start reaching for language they would never normally use about an economy. Language of intention, as though the cycle were not a string of accidents, but a thing with a memory. A thing that knows the script and is simply waiting for its cue. It is not, of course. There is no ghost in the machine. There is no curse on the pampers. Whatever the more mystical corners of the culture might whisper. Every light that comes on has a mechanical, traceable, almost boring cause. A deficit here, a printing decision there, a drought, an election, a panic. But the reason people reach for the language of intention, the reason it feels like the cycle is watching and waiting, is that the mechanical causes are locked so tightly together that the outcome becomes as predictable as if something was steering it. When every part of a system pushes every other part toward the same edge, the system behaves as if it wanted to go over, even though wanting has nothing to do with it. That is the uncanny thing about Argentina. And it is the uncanny thing about every trap of this kind. From the inside, structure is indistinguishable from fate. The people living it cannot tell the difference between a machine that has no choice and a destiny that was always coming, and after 50 years and 3 collapses, neither, in all honesty, can I. You will hear those denials in this story. I am going to give you the actual quotes, the actual names, the actual dates? Because they are some of the most extraordinary public statements ever made by people in power, and because they were not lies in the way you think. That is one of the things I want you to sit with by the end of this. The men who said the worst was over were not con artists. Most of them believed it. They could see the same four lights you and I can see, and it did not matter. That is the thing I cannot stop thinking about, and it is the reason this is not really a video about Argentina. Argentina is the laboratory. The experiment running inside it is much larger and much closer to you than you would like. Because the obvious lesson of a country that collapses once is bad luck. The obvious lesson of a country that collapses twice is incompetence. But the lesson of a country that collapses 3 times, in the same way with the same warning lights, with economists and ministers and the entire population able to read the dashboard and name every signal as it happens, is something far worse than bad luck or incompetence. It is the possibility that knowing is not enough. That a society can see the cliff coming, point at it, write papers about it, give it a name, and walk off the edge anyway, because the thing that pushes it is stronger than the thing that knows. Hold that. We are going to come back to it, and when we do, it is not going to be Argentina's dashboard I ask you to look at. For now, I want to take you to the beginning, not to the first collapse, but to the first time the warning lights were ever recorded, the day the machine was switched on, because once you have seen it ignite the first time, you will never be able to unsee the pattern in everything that follows. But before that, I have to tell you what Argentina was, because the descent only means something if you understand the height it fell from, and the height is almost impossible to believe. In the year 1900, Argentina was one of the 10 richest countries on the face of the earth. Not in South America, on Earth. By measures of income per person, it sat in the company of the United States, Britain, and Australia. In 1913, the year before the First World War, the average income of an Argentine was higher than the average income of a person in France. Higher than a person in Germany. Buenos Aires had electric trams and a subway system, the first in the Southern Hemisphere and in the entire Spanish-speaking world, running underground in 1913 while most of the planet was still lighting its homes with gas. Immigrants poured off the boats from Italy and Spain by the million, more per head of existing population than almost anywhere on the globe, because Argentina was where you went to get rich. There was a phrase that travelled through Europe in those years, rich as an Argentine. The economist Nauro Campos put the whole tragedy into a single sentence that has stayed with me since I first read it. He wrote that Argentina is the only country in the world that was developed in 1900 and developing in 2000. The only one. Every other nation that was rich at the dawn of the 20th century stayed rich, more or less, through wars and depressions and revolutions. One country, and only one, climbed all the way to the summit of the human race and then walked back down, and it is still walking down. Since 1960, Argentina has recorded more years of negative economic growth than any other country in the world. More than war zones, more than nations that were invaded and occupied. A country at peace with some of the most fertile land and best educated people on the planet has spent more of the last 6 decades getting poorer than anywhere else alive. I want to make that height real, because a phrase like top 10 in the world stays abstract until you furnish it. In 1913, the city of Buenos Aires opened the Teatro Colón, an opera house that to this day ranks among the finest acoustic spaces ever built, in the same breath as Milan and Vienna, sitting at the bottom of the map in a country most Europeans could barely place. The Argentine elite shipped their cattle to Europe and their children to Paris, and the phrase rich as an Argentine became a real expression in the French language, the way we might say rich as a king. The country drew immigrants at a rate the world had rarely seen, taking in newcomers relative to its existing population at a pace that in some years rivaled the United States. People crossed an ocean and bet their entire lives on this place, because this place was where the future seemed to be happening. And that is what makes the fall so disorienting, so genuinely hard for the mind to hold. We carry a comfortable story about why nations are poor. They lack resources, or they were colonized and stripped, or they were torn apart by war, or they never had the institutions or the schools or the land. Argentina had all of it. Fertile ground beyond almost any nation on earth. A literate, urban, largely European-descended population. No foreign occupation. Long stretches of peace. Every ingredient that economists will tell you a country needs in order to be rich, Argentina possessed in 1900, and possessed in abundance. And it became rich exactly as the theory predicts. And then it unbecame rich, which the theory does not predict at all, which the theory has no comfortable slot for, which is why scholars have argued about Argentina for a century, and why a serious academic paper on the subject can still carry a title as plaintive as a century of decline. The usual explanations for poverty simply do not apply here. Something else happened. Something that the possession of every advantage could not prevent. Hold that, because by the end it becomes the most important sentence in this entire story. Having every advantage did not prevent it. So when I say a country collapsed 3 times, understand that this is not a story about a poor place that could never get its act together. This is a story about a rich place that taught itself how to fall and then could not stop doing it, and the falling has a structure, and the structure is the same every time. Therefore, the place to start is the day the structure first appeared. That day was the 4th of June, 1975. 2 days earlier, a man named Celestino Rodrigo had ridden the subway, the Line A, the old wooden one, to the seat of government in Buenos Aires to be sworn in as the new Minister of the Economy. Picture that, the incoming finance minister of a major nation taking the public underground railway to his own inauguration. It tells you something about how casual the whole thing was, how little anyone understood what was about to be unleashed. Rodrigo was not a famous economist. He was an engineer, a man with connections to the real power in the government, which at that moment was not the president at all. The president was Isabel Perón. She was the 3rd wife of Juan Perón, the towering figure of 20th century Argentine politics. The man whose movement still defines the country's 2 warring tribes to this day. Juan Perón had died in office in July of 1974, less than a year earlier, and his widow, a former cabaret dancer with no political experience of her own, had inherited the presidency. The man actually pulling the strings behind her was her private secretary, José López Rega, a sinister figure obsessed with the occult who also happened to be running death squads. He was the patron who had installed Rodrigo. Hold on to López Rega. He is going to matter. López Rega is worth pausing on, because he is the kind of figure who makes Argentine history read like something a novelist would be ordered to tone down. A former police corporal who had reinvented himself as a mystic, fixated on astrology and the occult, he had worked his way into the Perón household as a kind of spiritual advisor and emerged as the most powerful man in the country. He ran the Ministry of Social Welfare, and out of that ministry, he also ran the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, the AAA, a death squad that murdered hundreds of left-wing activists, students and intellectuals in the years before the military even took power. This was the man who chose Argentina's economy minister, not on the basis of monetary theory, on the basis of loyalty and palace intrigue. The fate of the currency, the savings of millions, the trigger that would help tip the country into dictatorship. was placed in the hands of an engineer because a death squad running a cultist trusted him. I tell you this not as lurid background, but because it is the texture of how these decisions actually get made. We imagine economic catastrophe as the product of grand impersonal forces, and the forces are real, but the instant of detonation is almost always intensely, embarrassingly human. A man takes the subway to his own inauguration because a mystic put him there, and 2 days later he sets off a chain reaction that ends with bodies in the street. The country Rodrigo inherited was already sick. Inflation was running at around 40% a year, which sounds catastrophic by the standards of most countries, but was, by the standards of what was coming, almost quaint. There was a wide gap between the official exchange rate and the real one. The treasury was empty, and Rodrigo decided to fix it all at once, with a single shock, a brutal package of measures that the country would soon name after him. The Rodrigazo. In Argentine Spanish, adding that suffix to a name turns it into a kind of blow, an impact, a beating. The Rodrigo blow. On the 4th of June he announced it. The official value of the peso was cut by somewhere between 100 and 160%, depending on which of the rates you measured. An enormous devaluation overnight. The price of fuel went up by around 180%. Electricity by 75%. Public transport by 70%. And wages, the wages of the workers who would have to absorb all of this, were allowed to rise by only 45%, capped, held down, while everything around them doubled. The theory was that this would clear the distortions and stabilise the economy. The reality was the opposite. The reality was that he had taken a country with high but survivable inflation and detonated it. Between May and July of that year, in 2 months, consumer prices rose by 79%, not annualised, in 2 months. The official dollar climbed by 125%. And here is the first warning light, the one I told you to watch for, appearing for the very first time. The black market dollar, the real one, the one the people trusted, rose by 89% in the same window. The breccia, the breach, was open. 2 prices for the same dollar, and the country watching the gap. Now look at the second light. In December of 1974, 6 months before the Rodrigazo, the central bank had held international reserves of about $1.4 billion. By June of 1975, that number had fallen to $700 million. The reserves had been cut in half in 6 months, against an external debt of around $10 billion. The money was leaving, the defence was crumbling. And the people did what people in Argentina have learned to do, what they would do again in 1989, and again in 2001, and again right now. They ran. The unions exploded. The Sigit, the great labour confederation that was the very heart of the Peronist movement, did something it had never done before in its history. It called a general strike against a Peronist government. The movement turned on itself. On the 27th of June, and then again in a 48-hour strike in July, the country stopped. Rodrigo lasted 49 days. 49. He resigned on the 21st of July, having been in office for less than 2 months, leaving behind a country with monthly inflation that would soon touch 35% and a political order that was visibly disintegrating. Lopez Rega, the occultist puppet master who had put him there, fled the country. And the wound the Rodrigazo opened never really closed. The economist Guillermo Calvo would later draw the line directly from this chaos, from the 35% monthly inflation and the collapse of authority, to what happened next, which was that on the 24th of March, 1976, the military overthrew Isabel Perón and seized the country, beginning the bloodiest dictatorship in Argentine history, the years of the disappeared. Of thousands of people taken from their homes and never seen again, and the dictatorship did not fix the economy. This is worth saying clearly because there is a persistent fantasy in Argentina and far beyond it that a strong hand, a regime willing to be ruthless, can succeed where messy democracy fails. The generals were as ruthless as it is possible to be. They murdered and tortured and disappeared their own citizens by the thousand, and they ran the economy into the ground anyway, borrowing enormous sums abroad, more than $40 billion in foreign debt by the time they were finished, much of it vanishing into corruption and into a brief doomed war over the Falkland Islands that they launched in 1982, partly to distract a population that was once again watching its currency disintegrate. When the dictatorship finally collapsed in disgrace after losing that war, it handed the returning democracy a debt so large that it became the millstone around Alfonsin's neck, one of the direct reasons the Austral Plan could not hold, and the hyperinflation came. So the line runs unbroken. The Rodrigazo helped bring the generals ran up the debt helped bring the hyperinflation. Each collapse is not a separate event but a link in a chain, each one forging the conditions for the next, and the ruthlessness of the regime in the middle did not break the chain. It only added a layer of corpses to it. The strong hand was not an exception to the machine. It was just another set of hands on the same wheel, steering toward the same edge. I want you to sit with the scale of that for a second, because the numbers can hide it. A single economic shock package, designed by an engineer who took the subway to work, helped tip a nation into a military dictatorship that would murder its own citizens by the thousand. The personal and the economic are not two separate stories here. They never are in Argentina. They are the same thread running in both directions. But the Rodrigazo matters most for a reason that goes beyond the suffering it caused. It is the moment the machine was switched on. Before 1975, Argentine inflation averaged something like 28% a year over the previous 15 years, high but stable, livable in the 16 years after the Rodrigazo. Inflation averaged around 570% a year, more than 20 times worse. Something broke in 1975 that did not get fixed, a kind of psychological barrier, a loss of faith in the currency that, once gone, never came back. The country crossed a line into a new reality, and the 4 warning lights I described to you, the flight, the breach, the reserves, the denial, were now wired into the system, ready to light up again whenever the conditions returned. The denial light, I should tell you, did not appear in its full glory in the Rodrigazo itself. It appeared a few years later, under the military government, and it became the founding scripture of an entire Argentine genre, a genre of famous last words. In 1981, the economy minister of the dictatorship, a man named Lorenzo Segaut, faced a run on the peso. People were dumping pesos and buying dollars, the way they always do, the way they had learnt to. And Segaut went on the record with a phrase that every Argentine over the age of 40 can still recite from memory. El que apuesta al dólar pierde. He who bets on the dollar loses. He said it to stop the run, to reassure people that the peso would hold. Within days the peso was devalued. Then devalued again. Anyone who had bet on the dollar, anyone who had ignored the minister and bought dollars anyway, made a fortune. Anyone who had believed him was wiped out. He who bets on the dollar loses became the most sarcastic sentence in the Argentine language, a phrase people now say to each other with a bitter laugh whenever a politician promises that the currency is safe. It is the national monument to the 4th warning light, the official standing at the edge of the cliff, telling the crowd there is no cliff. So the machine was on, the lights were wired, the country had learned, at the level of instinct, that the peso was a trap and the dollar was an escape, and that when a minister told you otherwise, you should do the opposite of what he said. Argentina spent the late 1970s and early 80s in chronic, grinding, high inflation, never quite stabilizing, the dictatorship piling up foreign debt and then collapsing in disgrace after losing the Falklands War to Britain in 1982. Democracy returned in 1983, and with it came a new president, a man of genuine decency named Raúl Alfonsín, who inherited an economy that was already a smoking ruin and who was about to discover that the machine, once switched on, does not care how good your intentions are. Because the worst was not the Rodrigazo. The worst was still 6 years away, and it would make everything I have just described look like a rehearsal. Raúl Alfonsín was not a villain. I want to establish that clearly, because the easy way to tell this story is to find a fool or a crook at the centre of each collapse, and Alfonsín was neither. He was a human rights lawyer who had stood up to the dictatorship, who put the generals on trial for their crimes, which almost no other country emerging from military rule had the courage to do. He believed in democracy in a way that cost him something, and he presided over one of the worst hyperinflations in recorded human history. When he took office in December of 1983, inflation was already running at over 400% a year. The debt the generals had run up was crushing. For the first 18 months, his government tried orthodox measures and got nowhere. So in June of 1985, they tried something dramatic. They launched what they called the Austral Plan. The centerpiece was a brand new currency. They killed the peso that had already had zeros chopped off it more than once, and they replaced it with a new unit called the Austral. One Austral was worth 1,000 of the old pesos. There it is again. The amputation. 3 more zeros gone. They froze wages and prices, they slashed government spending, and for a while, a brief, hopeful while, it worked. Inflation dropped from a monthly rate of around 30% to about 2%. The shops were stable, people could plan again. Alfonsín's party won the midterm elections of 1985 on the strength of it. For a moment it looked like Argentina had finally found the exit. It had not found the exit. It had found a pause. The thing about a price freeze is that it does not fix the underlying problem. It just hides it, the way holding a lid on a boiling pot hides the boil without lowering the heat. The underlying problem in Argentina was, and is, and has always been, a government that spends far more than it collects and covers the difference by printing money. The Austral Plan froze the prices, but it did not fix the deficit. The state kept spending, kept printing, and the pressure kept building under the lid. By 1986 the cracks were showing. By 1987 the plan was failing. In 1988 the government launched a last-ditch effort called the Spring Plan, the Plan Primavera, a final desperate attempt to hold the structure together. And here the warning lights begin to come on, one after another, in the order you now know. The International Monetary Fund refused to back the Spring Plan. That refusal mattered, because it told the financial world that the people with the deepest knowledge of Argentina's books did not believe the numbers would hold. The signal went out, and the money began to move. The Argentine economic establishment, the people with the most to lose and the best information, started pulling their deposits out of the banks, withholding the dollars their exports had earned, delaying their tax payments, doing everything that a person does when they have decided the ship is going down and they want to be in the lifeboat before the rush. Capital flight. The first light. Then, in January of 1989, the second and third lights blazed at once. The central bank tried to hold the exchange rate, to defend the Austral against the dollar, and in the attempt, in the space of a few weeks, it lost essentially all of its reserves. Read that again slowly. The institution whose entire job is to defend the currency emptied its vault trying to defend the currency, and the currency broke anyway. On the 6th of February, 1989, the central bank gave up and let the Austral float. The dam was gone. What followed was not inflation as you understand the word. This is the place where I have to stop and correct something, because almost everyone misunderstands what hyperinflation actually is, and the misunderstanding makes the horror smaller than it really was. You probably think hyperinflation means prices going up very fast. That is not wrong, but it misses the actual nature of the thing, the part that makes it a different kind of event entirely. Ordinary inflation is when money slowly loses value. Hyperinflation is when money stops being able to hold a value at all. It is the death of the unit of account. It is the moment when the number on the price tag stops meaning anything, because by the time you have carried the item to the register, the number has changed, and the cashier no longer trusts the till, and the store no longer trusts the cashier. And the whole invisible web of trust that lets a piece of paper stand in for a day of human labour simply dissolves. Money is, at bottom, a kind of shared memory. It is the economy's way of remembering what things are worth. Hyperinflation is that memory failing. It is collective amnesia about value, happening in real time, and once it starts it feeds on itself, because the faster the money forgets, the faster everyone rushes to spend it before it forgets any more. In Argentina in the middle of 1989, the money forgot almost everything it knew. In the city of Rosario, inflation in the single month of May was 96.5%. Prices nearly doubling inside 30 days. In one city. Across the country, the supposedly fixed exchange rate, the one the central bank had floated, ran from 80 Australs to the dollar to 200 Australs to the dollar inside a single month. Stores stopped putting prices on goods because the prices were meaningless by the time they were written. Workers were paid and ran, literally ran, from the workplace to the shops to convert their wages into anything physical before the wages turned to paper in their hands. There are accounts of supermarket employees moving through the aisles with price guns, marking everything up, while customers followed behind them grabbing items off the shelves at the old price before the new one could catch up. The money was burning in people's pockets. I want to slow down inside that month, because the statistics, 96% here, 197% there, slide past too easily, and underneath each one is the texture of ordinary life coming apart. When money loses value this fast, the entire architecture of normal existence stops working. A restaurant cannot print a menu because the prices on it are wrong by lunchtime. A worker cannot be paid monthly because a month of wages agreed at the start of the month is worth a fraction by the end, so payment schedules compress to weekly, then to daily, then in the worst stretches to twice a day. Shopkeepers stop selling, because why would you trade a real can of food for paper that will buy less by closing time, and so shelves empty not only because people are buying, but because owners are hoarding their own goods rather than accept dying money for them. The shelves empty from both ends at once. And into that vacuum comes the fear, and then the hunger, and then the crowds. The looting of 1989 was not, for the most part, criminality in the way the word usually means. It was people who could no longer afford to eat, watching the price of bread climb past their reach in real time, breaking into supermarkets to take food. It began in Rosario, the country's third largest city, in late May, and spread through the poor neighbourhoods ringing the capital. The government of the human rights lawyer, the decent man, declared a state of emergency and sent in the police, and in the confrontations 14 people died, some accounts say 20 ordinary people killed in the streets of a country at peace over the price of groceries. There is no war in this part of the story, no invasion, no earthquake. The thing that put 14 people in the ground was a number. The value of the austral, falling faster than human beings, could adapt to it falling. The monthly inflation rate peaked in July of 1989 at 197%. For the year, the most commonly cited figure for 1989 is 3,079%. Some measurements, taken from December to December, put it closer to 5,000%. And if you take the worst single month, July, and annualize it, project that rate out over a full year, the number a Federal Reserve economist later produced was 46 million%. I am not going to pretend that last number describes a full year that anyone lived through, because no one did. The rate did not hold for a year. But I give it to you because it tells you what the speedometer read at the worst instant. The needle was pinned past the edge of the dial, and people died. This is the part that gets lost when we talk about inflation as if it were a chart. In late May and June of 1989, the hunger and the desperation boiled over into looting. It started in Rosario and spread to the poor suburbs ringing Buenos Aires. Crowds broke into supermarkets and carried out food. The government declared a state of emergency. In the violence and the police response, 14 people were killed. Some counts put it at 20. Poverty in Greater Buenos Aires, which had been around 14% in 1985 when the Austral Plan was briefly working, had risen to 38% by 1989. In 4 years, more than a third of the population of the capital region had been pushed below the poverty line by the failure of the money. Alfonsin, the decent man, the human rights lawyer, was finished. He had lost the election to a Peronist named Carlos Menem, but the handover was not supposed to happen until December. The country could not wait that long. The economy was in free fall, and the government had lost the authority to do anything about it. So Alfonsin resigned early, handing power to Menem 6 months ahead of schedule. In July of 1989, in the middle of the inferno, a president, elected democratically, fleeing his own office not because of a coup, but because the money had collapsed underneath him. And here is a detail that almost everyone forgets, one that matters enormously for everything that comes later, because it is the first appearance of a move Argentina would make again 12 years on. Menem took office in July, but the money did not stabilise when he arrived. There was a second hyperinflationary burst at the end of 1989 and into the start of 1990, the inferno reigniting after a brief lull. And to put it out, the new government did something extraordinary, something that should sound very familiar by the time we reach 2001. In December of 1989, it announced what became known as the Bonex Plan. The government reached into the banks and seized a huge portion of the population's short-term deposits, their savings, their fixed-term accounts, and forcibly converted them into government bonds that would not mature for 10 years. Your money, the money you had in the bank, was taken and replaced with a piece of paper promising to maybe pay you back in a decade. In a country where a decade was an eternity, and a promise was worth roughly what the last promise had been worth. Read that, and then remember the Corralito of 2001, the freeze on withdrawals, the forced conversion of dollar accounts. They are the same move. The state, cornered, with no reserves and no credit and no options, reaches past every assurance it has ever given, and takes the savings of the people who trusted it, because the alternative is the immediate collapse of the banks. It happened in 1989 with the Bonex Plan, and it happened again in 2001 with the Corralito and the Pacification. And the fact that it happened twice, that the second time was carried out by people who had lived through the first, is the whole pattern in miniature. They knew exactly what it did to people. They had watched it. And when they were cornered, they did it again, because the structure left them no other door. That is not a story about villains. It is a story about a trap that produces the same desperate act no matter who walks into it. That is the first full collapse, not the Rodrigazo, which was the ignition. This, 1989. The machine ran its complete program for the first time. Flight, breach, reserves to zero, and then the denial giving way to the deluge. And if you are keeping count, this is collapse number 1 of the 3 in the title, and we are already at a level of horror that most countries never experience even once. You would think, after that the lesson would have been learned so deeply, burned so far into the national memory, that it could never happen again. The supermarket looting, the 14 dead, the president fleeing 6 months early, the money turning to ash in workers' hands. How could a country live through that and ever let itself get close again? It got close again 12 years later, and the second time, it built the road to the cliff on purpose, with the best of intentions, calling it a permanent solution. And the man who saw the trap coming wrote it down in advance and was ignored for a decade. To understand the second collapse, you have to understand the cure they invented for the first one, because the cure was the disease. After the 1989 hyperinflation, after Menem took over, Argentina did something radical. In 1991, under an economy minister named Domingo Cavallo, the country passed what was called the convertibility law, and the idea was beautiful in its simplicity, which is exactly what made it so dangerous. The law said that 1 peso would equal $1. Not approximately, exactly, and by force of law, and to make the promise credible, the central bank committed to holding $1 in reserve for every peso it issued. The peso was no longer a national currency in the ordinary sense. It was a claim check on a dollar sitting in a vault. You could walk into any bank and trade your pesos for dollars at 1-to-1, any time, guaranteed. The point was to make it impossible for the government to print money the way it always had, because every new peso had to be backed by a real dollar that the country had actually earned. They were tying their own hands. They were building a cage around the printing press. And it worked, in the way that a tourniquet works. Inflation collapsed almost overnight. By the mid-1990s, Argentina had stable prices for the first time in living memory. Foreign money poured in. The shops were full. Argentines could travel abroad and find their pesos worth real dollars. Cavallo became a national hero, the man who slew the inflation dragon. And I want you to feel how seductive that decade was, because the seduction is the trap. And a story that skips the good years cannot explain why anyone fell for it. The early and middle 1990s in Argentina, under Menem and Cavallo, were a kind of fever dream of first world normalcy. For the first time in living memory, the price on the shelf in the morning was the same as the price in the evening, and the same the next week and the next month. And you cannot understand what a gift that is until you have lived without it. Argentines could plan. They could sign a contract, take a loan, save towards something, all the ordinary acts of economic life that hyperinflation had made impossible. And because 1 peso equaled $1 by law, Argentines were suddenly, on paper, dollar rich. They flew to Miami to shop. The era produced its own legend, the image of Argentines abroad so flush they were ordering pizza with champagne, a phrase that became shorthand for the giddy unreality of it all. The country felt as though it had finally arrived, finally rejoined the wealthy world it had belonged to a century earlier, and lost. It was a mirage, and not a malicious one. The stability was real while it lasted. But it stood on a currency that could not bend, propped up more and more by borrowed dollars, and the borrowing was the quiet thing happening underneath the shopping trips, the debt climbing while the citizens celebrated. The good years were not a lie told to the people. They were a real experience that happened to be built on a fault line, and the cruelty of it is that the better it felt, the more catastrophic the eventual fall had to be, because more people had staked their lives on the assumption that it would last. Cavallo had promised 6 decades. The people believed him because for a while the evidence was on his side. That is how these traps always close. Not with an obvious villain, but with a genuine good that everyone has a reason to protect. Right up until the moment it kills them. He stood up and declared that with convertibility, Argentina would have more than 6 decades of growth and prosperity. 6 decades. It lasted about 10 years before it killed the patient. Here is the problem, and it is the kind of problem that is invisible while the sun is shining and fatal the moment it starts to rain. If your currency is locked 1-to-1 to the dollar, you can never adjust it. Ever, normally, when a country's economy gets uncompetitive, when its goods get too expensive for the rest of the world to buy, its currency falls, and that fall makes its exports cheap again and rebalances the whole system. It is a release valve. Convertibility welded the release valve shut. The peso could not fall, by law, no matter what happened. So when the dollar got strong in the late 1990s, the peso got strong with it, locked at the hip, and Argentine goods became wildly overpriced on world markets. Then, in 1999, neighbouring Brazil, Argentina's largest trading partner, devalued its own currency, instantly making Brazilian goods far cheaper than Argentine ones. Argentina could not respond. The valve was welded shut. The country began to suffocate. There was a man who had seen this coming with almost supernatural clarity. His name is Steve Hanke, an American economist at Johns Hopkins University, one of the world's leading authorities on currency systems. And in October of 1991, just months after convertibility was launched, while the entire country was celebrating its new hero Cavallo, Hanke published a warning in the Wall Street Journal. He pointed out that the Argentine system was not a true orthodox currency board of the kind that had worked elsewhere. It had a fatal flaw built into it, a discretion that would eventually be abused, and he predicted that it would in the end collapse. He was right. He was right 10 years early, and almost nobody listened, because the system was working, the prices were stable, the hero was on television, and who wants to hear an American professor explaining that the thing making you feel safe is going to destroy you? This is the third warning light in a form you will see again and again in this story, the form where it is not that nobody knew. It is that the people who knew were inconvenient and were therefore set aside. Hanke was not wrong. He was early. And being early, in the politics of a country that desperately wants to believe its problems are solved, is functionally the same as being wrong. You get filed in the same drawer. I want to keep Hanke in front of you, because his arc is one of the strangest and most telling in the whole 50 years. He was not some perpetual doomsayer who happened to be right once. He was, and is, one of the foremost experts on currency boards and dollarization on Earth, a man who had helped design monetary systems in country after country. He understood the Argentine convertibility system better than the people who built it, well enough to identify in 1991 the precise flaw that would kill it 10 years later. He even advised the Menem government on going further, on fully dollarizing, abolishing the peso entirely and adopting the dollar outright in 1995 and again in 1999, which would have removed the very discretion he warned about. They did not do it, and the thing he warned would happen happened on schedule in 2001. Now hold that, because we are going to need it at the very end of this story, and when it returns it is going to land differently than it does now. The economist who diagnosed the 2001 collapse a decade in advance, who was treated as an inconvenient foreign academic and filed away, is the same economist who, more than 30 years later, would become the intellectual godfather of the most radical attempt to break the cycle in Argentine history. The man nobody listened to in 1991 would, in his 80s, be consulted on the very policy a new president would campaign on. The wheel turns slowly in Argentina, and the people who are right too early sometimes live long enough to be right again, which is a kind of vindication and also a kind of curse, because being right about Argentina has never once been enough to change what Argentina does. By 2000, Argentina was in a deep recession. The economy would ultimately shrink by more than 20%. Some measures say more than 25% over the period from 1998 to 2002. Unemployment climbed above 25%. Poverty rose toward 50%, half the country, and the warning lights, which had been switched on since 1975 and never truly switched off, began to blaze. Capital flight. The first light. People with money could see exactly where this was going, and they started moving their savings out of pesos and out of the country. The wealthy went first, as they always do, as they did in 1989, as they would again. Deposits began draining out of the banking system through 2001, slowly and then quickly. By the time the crisis peaked, deposits had fallen by around 22% from their high point earlier that year. The money was leaving. The breach. The second light. Convertibility was supposed to make a breach impossible, because the law guaranteed 1 peso equals $1. But you cannot legislate belief. As the run accelerated, the real, expected value of the peso, the value people believed it actually had, detached from the legal value the government insisted on. The official rate said 1-to-1. Everyone could feel that the real number was something much worse, and they acted on the feeling. The reserves. The third light. The whole convertibility system depended on the central bank actually having the dollars to back the pesos. As people raced to convert their pesos to dollars and pull them out, the reserves that backed the entire structure started pouring out the door. And then came the day that I think about more than almost any other in this story. The 30th of November, 2001. In that single day, $2 billion in reserves left the Argentine banking system. $2 billion in one day. The defense was not crumbling anymore. It was hemorrhaging. The government had a choice. It could let the banks run dry, which meant the collapse of the entire banking system. Or it could lock the doors. It locked the doors. On the 1st of December 2001, the government, with Cavallo back as economy minister, the same Cavallo, the hero of 1991 now presiding over the wreckage of his own creation, imposed a measure that would become one of the most hated words in the Argentine language. The Corralito. The little corral, the little pen, the playpen. It was a freeze on bank withdrawals. Argentines were now allowed to take out only 250 pesos, or dollars per week, from their own accounts. Their own money. Money they had earned and deposited and trusted to the banks. Locked away, behind a fence, available only in a trickle. Think about what that means at the human level, because the abstraction hides the cruelty. You have spent your whole life saving. You have done everything right. You put your money in the bank, because the bank is safe, because that is what banks are for. And one morning you wake up, and the government has decided that your money is no longer fully yours, that you may have a small allowance of it each week, like a child, while the value of what remains behind the fence is about to be cut to a fraction of what it was. 250 per week. Roughly the amount a middle-class family needed for a week of groceries, and not a peso more. the country detonated, and this time it was not just the poor suburbs, it was everyone. Because the Corralito had reached into the bank accounts of the middle class, the people who had played by every rule, and that is a different kind of rage. On the 18th of December, the looting began again, the echo of 1989. On the 19th, the president, Fernando de la Rúa, went on television and declared a state of siege, a suspension of normal rights, an attempt to impose order by decree. It had the opposite effect. That night, in a spontaneous uprising that no party organised and no leader called, the people of Buenos Aires came out onto their balconies and into the streets banging pots and pans. The Corralito, the sound of a nation hitting its own kitchenware in fury, a metallic roar rolling across the city, the sound of the social contract breaking. Before I tell you how that night ended, I have to give you the denial, the fourth light, because it is the most infamous one of all, the one that became a wound that has never healed. As the Corralito trapped people's savings, as the peso prepared to collapse, the officials told the public, repeatedly and on the record, that their dollars were safe. El que depositó dólares recibirá dólares. He who deposited dollars will receive dollars back. It was said to calm the panic, to assure people that even if everything else fell apart, the dollars they had specifically saved in dollars, not pesos, dollars, would be returned to them as dollars. They were not returned as dollars. In early 2002, the accounts were forcibly converted, pesified. The dollar deposits turned into pesos at a rate that destroyed most of their value when the peso was finally allowed to crash. People who had carefully saved in the world's safest currency, who had done the one thing every Argentine knows to do, who had trusted dollars precisely because they did not trust pesos, watched the government reach into their accounts and turn their dollars into a fraction of their worth. The actor Ricardo Darín, one of Argentina's most beloved, has spoken about his own mother asking him, until the final days of her life, whether she was ever going to get her money back. She never did. There was a computer scientist named Ricardo Yardos who had $77,000 in the bank and recovered about $40,000. These are not statistics. These are the savings of careful people, the kind of people who do everything right, evaporating because they believed a sentence a man said on television. He who deposited dollars will receive dollars. It is the second great monument in the genre Sagat, founded in 1981. The official at the edge of the cliff, telling the crowd to trust him. Now here is how the night of the 19th and 20th of December, 2001, ended. The state of siege did not work. The Corralito grew. On the 20th, protesters filled the Plaza de Mayo, the great square in front of the presidential palace, the Casa Rosada, the Pink House. The police moved against them. In the violence of that day, in the plaza and around the country, people were killed. The most widely accepted figure, the one on the memorial, is 39 dead across the nation in those December days. Among them were children. Some were teenagers shot during the looting and the clashes. 39 people dead because the money collapsed. Let me name them, the 5 presidents, because the speed of it is hard to believe stated plainly. Fernando de la Rúa fell on the 20th of December. The head of the Senate, Ramon Puerta, stepped in as interim head of state. Then on the 23rd, the Congress installed Adolfo Rodriguez Sá, who declared the default to applause and lasted 7 days before the support collapsed under him. Then another interim figure, Eduardo Camargo. And then, on the 1st and 2nd of January, the Congress chose Eduardo Duhalde to serve out the term, 5 men holding the highest office in the land inside, roughly 2 weeks. A country cycling through heads of state the way the looters cycled through the supermarket shelves, grabbing whatever was within reach, because nothing would hold its value long enough to matter. And underneath the political chaos, the quieter catastrophe, the one that does not make the footage, was happening in millions of homes. The Corralito did not just freeze money, it froze lives. People could not pay for medical treatment because they could not reach their own funds. Small businesses that needed cash to pay suppliers simply died, locked out of their own accounts. There was a wave of what the press called Corralito suicides, people who had lost everything. Often older people whose entire life savings sat behind the fence and were about to be slashed in value, who could not face starting over at 60 or 70 with nothing. The actor Ricardo Darín has spoken of his mother, who asked him until the end of her life whether the money was ever coming back, and never got it, and never stopped asking. There was the computer scientist with $77,000 who clawed back about 40. Multiply those by a nation. This is the part of an economic collapse that the charts cannot show you, the part that does not annualize or convert into a percentage. It is the specific, individual, unglamorous destruction of people who did everything they were told to do, who saved, who trusted, who believed the man on the television, and who were turned, in a single week, from secure into ruined, and who carried that betrayal in their bodies for the rest of their lives. And Domingo Cavallo, the hero of 1991, resigned in the early hours, his entire cabinet with him. Later that day, the 20th of December, President Fernando de la Rúa, unable to govern a country that was burning, left the Casa Rosada the way a defeated leader leaves when the streets are too dangerous for a car. He left by helicopter, lifting off from the roof of the presidential palace as the city raged below him. There is footage of it. The helicopter rising off the Pink House, and you can read the entire collapse in that single image. A head of state escaping his own seat of power through the air because the ground was no longer his. What came next has no real parallel in the modern history of a major democracy. Argentina went through 5 presidents in 2 weeks. De la Rúa fell on the 20th, then a caretaker, then a man named Adolfo Rodriguez Sá, who on the 23rd of December 2001 stood before the Congress and announced that Argentina would default on its foreign debt, and the chamber, astonishingly, broke into applause. They cheered the default. It was the largest sovereign default in the history of the world up to that point. The exact figure depends on what you count, and the sources genuinely disagree, which I will be honest with you about. The bonds alone came to somewhere around $81 billion. The total defaulted external debt is usually given as somewhere between $93 and $100 billion. Broader measures of the public debt run as high as $145 billion. The headline number you will see most often is close to $100 billion, and it was, at the time, the biggest a country had ever walked away from. Rodriguez Sá lasted about a week before he too resigned. Then another caretaker. Then finally Eduardo Duhalde, the 5th president in 14 days, who took office in the first days of January 2002 and ended the convertibility experiment by letting the peso float. It immediately collapsed, losing around 3/4 of its value against the dollar by the end of that year. The cage around the printing press was gone. The promise of 1 peso equals $1, the promise that was supposed to last 6 decades, was dead in its 11th year, and the people who had trusted it were ruined. And the default did not end cleanly, the way you might imagine a default ends, with a line drawn and a fresh start. It dragged on for more than a decade, in a way that tells you something about how these things never really close. Most of Argentina's creditors eventually agreed to take a fraction of what they were owed, accepting heavy losses in restructurings in 2005 and 2010, but a group of investors refused. They had bought up the defaulted debt cheaply, and they wanted the full face value, and they sued, and the case ground through the courts of New York for years. Argentines call them the vulture funds. In 2014, an American federal judge named Thomas Griesa ruled that Argentina could not pay the creditors who had agreed to the deal without also paying the holdouts in full, and when Argentina refused, the country was forced into a second technical default in 2014 on debt it was actually trying to pay, blocked by a court thousands of miles away over the wreckage of the 2001 collapse. Sit with that for a moment, because it is its own small lesson nested inside the larger one. The collapse of 2001 was still producing defaults in 2014, 13 years later, still reaching forward through time to trip the country up. These events do not end. They metastasize. The debt from the dictatorship helped cause the hyperinflation. The default of 2001 was still detonating in 2014. The imp loan of 2018 would be refinanced by another imp loan in 2022 to deal with the debt from the first one. There is no clean slate in this story ever, for anyone. Each collapse leaves behind obligations that outlive the government that made them, that bind the hands of leaders not yet in office, that ensure the next crisis begins before the last one has finished. A country in this condition is never starting fresh. It is always paying for a fire that was lit before, while a new fire catches, and that overlapping, the way the disasters bleed into one another with no gap between them, is part of why the machine never stops. It is never given the chance to stop. There is never a moment of zero from which something new could begin. That is collapse number 2. And I want to stop here, because we have now seen the machine run twice in full, in 1989 and again in 2001, and the thing I need you to notice is not just that it happened twice, it is that the second time the country built the road deliberately. Convertibility was not an accident. It was a national project, celebrated, defended, a source of pride. The best minds in the country designed it, the population embraced it, and it walked them directly off the same cliff, in the same order, with the same 4 lights, 12 years after the last time. The man who warned them, Hanke, had been ignored for a decade. The denials were issued right up to the edge, the reserves drained, the breach opened, the money fled, the officials promised everything was fine, and then 39 people died and a president left by helicopter. So when I told you at the start that this is not really a story about bad luck, this is the moment I need that to land properly. Because here is the question that should be forming in your mind, the question that turns this from a history lesson into something colder. The people running Argentina in 2001 had lived through 1989. They were adults. They remembered the looting, the dead, the money turning to ash. They had every reason to know the pattern. And they did it again. Why? That is the question that the rest of this comes down to. And the answer is not stupidity, and it is not even corruption, though there was plenty of both. The answer is structural, and it is the part of this story that I think should genuinely disturb you, because once you understand why Argentina cannot stop, you start to wonder which other countries are wired the same way and simply have not run their program yet. I am going to come back to that, and when I do, I am not going to be talking about Buenos Aires. But first, I owe you the autopsy. 2 collapses down, and a pattern this exact does not come from nowhere. There is a machine underneath it, and I want to open it up and show you the gears. Because the gears are the whole point. So why can Argentina not stop? Why does the dashboard light up the same way every decade or so, regardless of who is in charge, regardless of what they learnt the last time. The first gear is the land, and it goes back to the very wealth I described at the beginning. The wealth that made Argentina one of the richest places on earth in 1900. That wealth came almost entirely from the pampas, the vast, flat, absurdly fertile grasslands that stretch out from Buenos Aires, some of the best agricultural land on the planet, capable of producing beef and wheat and later soy in staggering quantities with relatively little effort. In the 1870s and 80s, the Argentine state cleared the indigenous people off that land in a brutal military campaign and handed it, in enormous parcels, to a small number of families. By some accounts, the productive heart of the pampas ended up in the hands of no more than around 300 families, who organised themselves into a body called the Sociedad Rural, the Rural Society, and who became the closest thing Argentina had to an aristocracy. And here is a friction I am not going to soften, because the evidence supports it and the polite version obscures it. The concentration of that land was not only an economic arrangement, it was a political one, and it set up a war inside Argentina that has never ended and that sits underneath every collapse in this story. On one side stood the landed exporting class, who wanted an open economy, a tight link to world markets, low taxes on their exports, and a small state. On the other side, eventually, stood the urban working class and the movement that organised them, Peronism, which wanted industry, protection, a large and generous state, and a share of the wealth the land produced. These two forces have been locked in combat for the better part of a century, and the combat is not a side issue to the economic story. It is the economic story. Because every government that has come to power has owed its position to one side or the other, and has used the state to reward its own and punish its enemies. And the result is a country that lurches between two incompatible economic models every time power changes hands, never holding a single course long enough for anything to work. This is the deepest reason the machine cannot be switched off by knowledge alone. It is not that no one knows what to do, it is that what one half of the country is certain must be done. The other half is certain will destroy it, and both halves are powerful enough to sabotage the other, but not powerful enough to win permanently. So the country oscillates. A liberalising government opens the economy and is eventually broken by the social cost, and a Peronist government expands the state and is eventually broken by the fiscal cost, and each blames the other for the wreckage. And each is partly right, and the oscillation itself, the violent swing between two models every few years, does more damage than either model would do if it were simply allowed to run its course. The great commodity windfall of the 2000s, the soy boom, the rush of dollars that should have been used to break this cycle once and for all, was instead consumed by it. Spent and fought over and frittered away, so that when the soy price fell and the drought came, there was nothing saved, and the lights came on again. A country that cannot agree with itself about what it is cannot save itself, no matter how clearly its smartest people can see the cliff. The knowing is not shared, the wanting is at war, and the machine runs in the gap between them. This created a particular kind of economy and a particular kind of country. The wealth flowed from the land, from exports, from selling beef and grain to Europe. It did not flow from building things, from industry, from the broad middle-class development that made other rich nations durable. It was rent, in the economic sense, money that comes from owning a scarce resource rather than from producing or innovating. And rent economies concentrate wealth and concentrate power, and they make a country dependent on the price of whatever it digs out of the ground or grows on the surface. When commodity prices are high, the money floods in and everyone is happy. When commodity prices fall or a drought hits, the money stops and the whole structure shakes. That dependency is the second gear, and it is still turning today. Argentina's exports are dangerously concentrated in a handful of commodities. Soy and its derivatives alone make up around a fifth of all exports. Add cars, oil, corn, and beef, and a tiny number of products out of thousands account for more than 3/4 of everything the country sells to the world. So when the soy price drops, or when a historic drought hits, as one did in 2023, devastating the harvest, the dollars that the entire country depends on to function simply do not arrive. And a country that needs dollars and is not earning them is a country whose warning lights are about to come on. The same mechanism that hurt Argentina when European beef demand collapsed a century ago hurts it today when the soy fails. The crop changes. The vulnerability does not. The third gear is the one that turns the others into catastrophe, and it is the deepest one. It is the relationship between the government and the printing press. The through line of every single Argentine collapse, the Rodrigazo, 89, 2001, all of it is a government that spends more than it collects in taxes and covers the gap by creating money out of nothing. This is the engine of inflation, full stop. And Argentina has run a fiscal deficit, an annual gap between spending and revenue, for the overwhelming majority of the last 60 years. The state promises more than the economy can deliver, and rather than tell the people no, it prints. And printing is a tax, a hidden one, the cruelest one, because it falls hardest on the people holding cash, which is to say the poor. The people who cannot move their savings into dollars or land or foreign banks. Why does the state spend so much more than it collects? Partly because it cannot collect. This is the fourth gear, the broken tax system. Argentina has one of the largest informal economies in the developed world, a shadow economy estimated at somewhere around 30% of all economic activity. By some measures higher, with informal employment touching close to half the workforce. Enormous swaths of economic life happen off the books, in cash, invisible to the tax authority. The state is trying to fund a modern European-style welfare state on the tax base of a country where a third or more of the economy is hiding. The numbers cannot work, and so the printing press fills the gap, and the printing press is the thing that lights the fuse. And the fifth gear, the one that makes all of this self-reinforcing, that turns it from a problem into a trap, is the behaviour of ordinary Argentines themselves. And this is the part where you have to abandon any sense of superiority, because what Argentines do is not irrational. It is the most rational thing in the world. After living through 1975, 1989, 2001, after watching the peso destroyed again and again, after the Corralito reached into the bank and stole the savings of the careful, Argentines have learned, in their bones, that the peso is a trap and the dollar is safety. So they save in dollars. They keep dollars under the mattress, in safe deposit boxes, in accounts abroad. The estimates of how many undeclared dollars Argentines are holding outside the formal system run to something like $250 billion, an amount comparable to the entire annual output of the country, sitting in mattresses and foreign banks, doing nothing. Because the people do not trust their own money. And here is the trap. That distrust is rational, given the history, but it is also the thing that guarantees the next collapse. Because when people refuse to hold the national currency, when at the first sign of trouble they convert their pesos to dollars and pull them out, they cause the very run on the currency they were afraid of. The flight to the dollar is both the symptom and the cause. They run because they expect a collapse, and the running produces the collapse. It is a prophecy that fulfills itself every time, faster each time, because each collapse teaches the next generation to run sooner. Argentina has trained its own people, through 50 years of pain, to flee at the first flicker of the first warning light, and that flight is precisely what ensures the light keeps coming on. So you have a country with wealth that comes from rent rather than production, dangerously dependent on commodity prices, run by governments that chronically spend more than they collect, unable to collect because the economy hides from the taxman, printing money to cover the gap, with a population that has learnt to flee the currency at the first sign of trouble, which causes the collapse they are fleeing. Every gear drives every other gear. It is not a list of separate problems. It is a single machine, and every part of it reinforces every other part, and that is why no single reform ever fixes it. You cannot fix one gear in a machine where all the gears are locked together. And I want to plant something here, in the middle of the machine, that I am going to come back for. Every gear I have just described, the rent economy, the commodity dependence, the chronic deficit, the broken tax base, the rational flight from the currency, every one of them is a structural force, not a knowledge problem. Not one of these gears turns because Argentines failed to understand it. They turn because understanding a force is not the same as being able to stop it. The way understanding that you are falling is not the same as not falling. And if that is true, if the gears of a collapse are structural rather than informational, then the unsettling corollary is that any country with the same gears is vulnerable to the same machine, no matter how rich it is, no matter how sophisticated, no matter how certain it is that it is nothing like Argentina. A chronic deficit covered by the printing press, or by borrowing that can never realistically be repaid, is a chronic deficit. Whether it sits in Buenos Aires or somewhere with a far more famous skyline. Keep that in the back of your mind. The gears do not check your passport. The IMF deserves its own moment in this autopsy, because it is woven through every collapse. Argentina joined in 1956 and has signed more than 20 programs since, more than almost any nation alive. In 2006, the Peronist president Nestor Kirchner did something that thrilled the country. He paid off the entire IMF debt in a single move, around $9 9/10 billion, and declared that Argentina was free of the fund and its conditions, free to run its own affairs. It was a moment of real national pride, the debtor finally walking out of the loan office for good, and 12 years later, in 2018, Argentina walked right back in and signed the largest loan the fund had ever made to anyone. The freedom lasted a little over a decade, which is, you will notice, almost exactly the interval between collapses. The country pays off the fund, swears it is finished, and is back before the next generation has finished growing up. That is not a relationship, it is a tide. And over all of it sits the International Monetary Fund, the institution that has been involved in Argentina for so long and so often that it has become a character in the national drama, cast by different Argentines as either the doctor or the loan shark depending on their politics. Argentina joined the IMF in 1956. Since then it has signed more than 20 separate programs with the fund. By one accounting, in the 50 years from 1956 to 2006, Argentina spent 38 of them under an IMF program. 38 out of 50. The country has been on financial life support, on and off, mostly on for most of its modern existence, and the programs mostly failed, including, by the fund's own later admission, the giant one it would sign in 2018, which brings us to the third collapse, the one that is still happening, the one whose ending nobody yet knows. Because here is the thing about the machine I have just described. Knowing how it works does not switch it off. The economists know. The IMF knows. The ministers know. Steve Hanke knew in 1991. The population knows, in its bones, well enough to run at the first sign. Everybody can read the dashboard. And the dashboard lights up anyway. That is the part I keep circling, the part I cannot make peaceful, and it is about to get a great deal more personal, because the most recent time the lights came on, the man in charge was someone who understood the machine more completely than anyone who had ever held the office, who had spent his entire career describing exactly these gears in exactly these terms, and even he is now running a version of the same program. His name is Javier Milei. But before him, there was one more government that ran the machine in the most clarifying way of all, because it ran it while everyone was watching for it, and it lit up anyway. In 2015, Argentina elected a president named Mauricio Macri, a centre-right businessman, the son of a wealthy industrialist, a man who came to power explicitly promising to be the competent, market-friendly manager who would finally end the cycle of Peronist mismanagement and stabilise the country. He was the anti-populist, the serious man, the one who would balance the books and restore confidence. And his government produces, for our purposes, the cleanest demonstration in the entire 50 years of the thesis I have been building toward, because Macri did the responsible thing, secured the largest rescue package in the history of the institution meant to provide it. And the machine ran anyway. By 2018, the warning lights were coming on, the way they always do. Capital was flighting. The peso was falling. So Macri went to the International Monetary Fund and negotiated a rescue. And the size of it was historic. In June of 2018, the fund agreed to a standby arrangement of $50 billion. And that September it was raised to $57.1 billion. It was the single largest loan the IMF had ever made to any country in its history. The serious man had secured the serious money. The lifeline was the biggest ever thrown. And now I have to correct another thing you probably believe, because this is the misconception that lets the whole tragedy keep repeating. The belief that a bailout is a rescue, that when the IMF arrives with billions it is saving the country. Watch what the money actually did. Of that enormous package, around $44 billion was dispersed before the next government halted the program. And where did it go? It did not go into factories or into reserves that strengthened the country. An audit by Argentina's own National Audit Office found that something like 30% of the disbursements financed capital flight. The dollars came in the front door from the fund and went straight out the back door into the foreign accounts of people who were getting out. Over the relevant period, capital flight from Argentina reached around $45 billion by the central bank's own figures, with broader estimates running much higher. The IMF lent $57 billion, and tens of billions of it flowed directly through the country and out into the pockets of those who were leaving. Macri himself, years later, on CNN, in 2021, admitted what the money was for with a frankness that is almost unbelievable when you read it. He said the money was used to pay the commercial banks and investors who wanted to leave because they were afraid that Kirchnerism, the Peronist left, would return to power. In other words, by his own account, the largest loan in the history of the IMF was used in significant part to fund the orderly exit of the wealthy and the connected before the door slammed. That is the first warning light, capital flight, financed by the very rescue that was supposed to stop it. The bailout did not prevent the flight. The bailout paid for the flight. It did not work, of course. In August of 2019, Macri lost a primary election, and the markets, terrified that the Peronists were coming back, panicked. In 2 days, the country lost around $3 billion in reserves. I want to walk through how Macri arrived at that point, because his collapse is the most instructive of all for the country I am eventually going to ask you to think about, the one that is sure it is different. Macri had come to power promising gradualism, a slow and careful normalization that would avoid the shocks of the past. He lifted the previous government's currency controls, opened the economy, and went to the international markets to borrow the dollars to finance the transition. For a while, the money came cheaply. In 2017, Argentina even sold a 100-year bond, a bond that would not mature until the year 2117, and investors lined up to buy it, lending money to a country that had defaulted by then around 8 times in its history, on the theory that this time the serious manager would make it different. The appetite for that bond should have been the warning. When the world is eager to lend a serial defaulter money for 100 years, the world is not pricing risk, it is pricing hope. Then, in 2018, the conditions turned. American interest rates rose, which pulled money back toward the United States and away from risky places. A drought hit the harvest, cutting the dollars coming in from soy. And the first warning light came on, the way it always does. Capital began to leave. The peso started to slide in the spring of 2018, and once it started, the old reflex took over, the flight to the dollar, the run that produces the collapse it fears. The gradualist had no time for gradualism anymore. The slide became a crisis. The crisis became the largest imp loan in history, and the loan, as we have seen, largely financed the exit of the very people who no longer believed. By the time the August 2019 primary arrived and Macri lost it, the markets did not wait for the actual election in October. They had already read the dashboard. They knew a Peronist restoration was coming, and they ran, and the peso fell off a cliff in a single day, and the reserves bled out, and the serious manager, the anti-populist, the man who was going to end the cycle with competence and patience, reached for the same clamp every cornered Argentine government eventually reaches for, the cepo, the capital controls. The admission that the open economy he had promised was over. His debt-to-output ratio had climbed from the high 50s to near 90%. His 100-year bond was trading at a fraction of its value, and his term ended exactly where so many had ended before, with the controls back on and the lights still burning. The third light, blazing again. 2 days, 3 billion gone, and Macri's government did the thing every Argentine government eventually does. It reimposed capital controls, the cepo, the clamp, restrictions on how many dollars anyone could buy. The serious man, the competent manager, the one who was going to end the cycle, ended his term having overseen the largest imp loan in history vanish into capital flight, the peso lose most of its value, and the controls slammed back on. Argentina's debt as a share of its economy had jumped from around 57% when he took office to nearly 90% when he left. The Peronists came back, as the markets had feared under President Alberto Fernandez. In 2020, in the middle of the global pandemic, Argentina defaulted again, technically on its debt, and then restructured around $65 billion of it with private creditors. Then it signed yet another deal with the IMF, this one for $44 billion, essentially to deal with the debt from the previous IMF deal. Loans to pay loans. The fund's office in Buenos Aires, which a previous Peronist president, Nestor Kirchner, had once triumphantly closed in 2006 after paying off the country's debt and declaring independence from the fund, was long since reopened. Argentina was once again the fund's largest debtor, on life support watching the lights, and inflation, which had never really left, came roaring back. By the end of 2023, annual inflation was running well over 200%. The black market dollar, the blue dollar as Argentines now call it, the eternal second exchange rate, had detached from the official rate by an enormous margin. The gap, the brecha, the breach, reached close to 200% at points. 2 prices for the dollar, and the real one nearly triple the official one. To understand how deeply this lives in ordinary Argentine life, you have to understand the blue dollar as a daily reality and not just a figure on a screen. In a normal country, the exchange rate is something most people never think about, a number for travelers and traders. In Argentina, the gap between the official dollar and the blue dollar is checked by ordinary people every single morning, the way other people check the weather or the score. There are entire informal networks for buying dollars outside the official system, places known as quavers, caves, back rooms behind shops and offices, where you can trade your pesos for physical American banknotes at the real rate, the blue rate, no questions asked. People are paid partly in cash, they immediately convert. They price their apartments, their cars, their savings in dollars, performing the daily mental arithmetic of two currencies, because they have learned that the peso in their pocket is a melting thing and the dollar is the only solid ground. An entire society has reorganized its inner life, its sense of what a thing is worth, around the assumption that the national money cannot be trusted to hold. And this is the trap closing again, the fifth gear I told you about, the one where the rational behavior of individuals guarantees the collapse they fear. Because a country where everyone instinctively converts pesos to dollars at the first tremor is a country that cannot withstand a tremor. The flight is preloaded. The run is always one bad headline away, because the entire population has been conditioned across 3 generations to run, and they run faster each time, because each collapse teaches the next one to leave sooner. The blue dollar is not just a measure of the disease, it is the disease, made into a daily habit, a reflex burned so deep that no government can legislate it away. Milei, to his credit, managed for a while to nearly close that gap, to bring the blue rate and the official rate within a few percentage points of each other, which had not happened in years, and Argentines noticed and hoped. But the reflex is still there, underneath the hope, waiting. The quavers did not close. They just went quiet. And quiet is not the same as gone. The machine was running again, the third full time in the story, and the country was exhausted, poorer than it had been in decades, and ready to do something it had never done before. It elected a man who promised to take a chainsaw to the entire thing. I have been building toward Javier Milei for this whole story, and I have to be careful here, because his chapter is not finished. And I am not going to pretend to know how it ends, and I am going to be honest with you about the things that are genuinely going well, because the easy version of this story would ignore them, and the honest version cannot. Javier Milei is an economist, not a businessman like Macri, not a lawyer like Alfonsín, not a dynastic politician, an economist, and specifically an economist of a particular school, the Austrian school, the tradition most obsessed with exactly the gears I described to you, the relationship between government spending and money printing and inflation. Before he entered politics, he was a television commentator, famous for screaming about precisely this machine, about the fiscal deficit and the printing press and the destruction of the currency, in furious, profane, brilliant tirades. He understood the disease more completely than any leader in the country's modern history, because diagnosing this exact disease had been his entire professional life. He campaigned holding a chainsaw in the air, a literal chainsaw, as the symbol of what he would do to the state spending that he correctly identified as the root of the whole catastrophe. He won the presidency in November of 2023 and took office that December. There is an irony sitting at the centre of Milei's government, so sharp that if you put it in a novel, an editor would cut it for being too neat. The man Milei chose to run the economy, his minister of the economy, the person actually executing the program, is Luis Caputo, and Luis Caputo is the same man who back in 2018 had been at the centre of Macri's dealings with the IMF, the finance official associated with that record $57 billion loan and with managing the reserves as they drained out of the country. In 2018, Javier Milei, then a television economist, had publicly savaged Caputo, accusing him in his furious on-air style of having, in his words, smoked $15 billion from the IMF, of being responsible for the disaster at the central bank. He named him as part of the problem, one of the people who had run the machine. And then, 5 years later, having won the presidency on a promise to destroy the machine forever, Milei made that same man the steward of the entire economy. The accuser hired the accused to perform the cure. I do not say this to mock Milei, who may yet succeed, and whose grasp of the underlying disease is real and rare. I say it because it is the perfect emblem of how this works. The pool of people who actually know how to operate the levers of the Argentine state is small, and it is the same pool every time, and so the man you denounced as an arsonist becomes, when you reach power, the firefighter you cannot do without, because there is no one else who knows where the hoses are. The expertise and the failure live in the same people, because they have all been through the same fires. Even the revolution, the chainsaw, the great break with the past, ends up staffed by the veterans of the very thing it promised to break with. The new is run by the old, because the old is all there is. And he did in fact do remarkable things. I am not going to take that away from him, because it is true. He devalued the wildly overvalued official peso immediately, by more than 50%, ripping the bandage off rather than peeling it slowly. He took the chainsaw to government spending with a ferocity no one had managed before. And he achieved something Argentina had not seen in 14 years, a budget surplus. The government, for the first time in over a decade, spent less than it collected. The fiscal deficit, the deepest gear, the engine of the whole machine, was, at least on paper, switched off. Inflation, which had peaked at a monthly rate above 25% right as he took office, began to fall, and by late 2025 the annual rate had come down to around 30%, which in Argentine terms is a kind of miracle. The blue dollar, the black market rate, which for decades had run far above the official rate, collapsed toward it, the breach nearly closing, the two prices for the dollar converging to within a few percentage points for the first time in years. If you stopped the story there, it would be a story of triumph. The man who understood the machine finally switched off the central gear. And maybe, that is the story we will be telling in 5 years. I want to hold that door open honestly, because the alternative, pretending I know it will fail, would be exactly the kind of false certainty I am asking you to distrust everywhere else. But the lights came on again. Even now, even with the surplus, even with the chainsaw, even with the economist who understood everything, the cost of the adjustment fell, as it always does, on the people least able to bear it. Poverty surged past 50% in the first half of 2024 as the shock took hold. And more dangerously for the survival of the whole project, the old gears started turning underneath the new surplus. To bring inflation down, the government leaned on keeping the peso strong, arguably too strong, the same overvaluation trap that helped kill convertibility. A strong peso makes imports cheap and holidays abroad affordable and inflation low, and it also drains the dollars out of the country, because everyone rushes to buy the cheap dollars while they can. Through 2024 and into 2025, the central bank's net reserves, the dollars it actually has free to defend the currency, were negative. Negative, the institution meant to defend the peso had, on a net basis, less than nothing in the vault, the same condition as January 1989, the same condition as November 2001, the third warning light, not flickering, but solidly, structurally lit. In April of 2025, Milei signed a new deal with the IMF, another extended facility, around $20 billion, with $12 billion up front. The economist who had spent his life raging against the cycle of borrowing was now borrowing from the same fund, the country's 20-something program. And then, in September of 2025, the oldest trigger of all pulled itself. Milei's party lost a provincial election in Buenos Aires. And the markets did exactly what they did to Macri in 2019, exactly what they did in 1989, exactly what they always do. They saw a political signal that the reformer might lose power, and they ran for the dollar. Reserves began falling at a rate of more than $1 billion a week against a gross stockpile of only around 30 billion, with the truly usable portion far smaller. The first light and the third light blazing together in the autumn of 2025 under the man who understood the machine better than anyone. And here is where the most recent chapter becomes something genuinely new, something that has never happened in the 50 years of this story, and I want you to notice how strange it is. On the 9th of October 2025, the rescue did not come from the IMF, and it did not come from within Argentina. It came from the Treasury of the United States. The American Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, announced that the United States would establish a currency swap line and actively purchase Argentine pesos using a special American fund to hold the peso up. The United States government directly bought pesos to defend the currency of Argentina. He called it a moment of acute illiquidity. By the end of that October, the American Treasury had traded for around $2.5 billion worth of pesos, and the speed of what followed is its own kind of signal. By the 9th of January 2026, only 3 months after the intervention began, Argentina had repaid the funds it had drawn, and Bessent announced that the American fund held no more Argentine pesos. You can read that two ways, and both are true at once, which is the maddening thing about the present moment. You can read it as success, as proof that the illiquidity really was a passing squeeze, that Milei's program is sound enough that the lifeline was needed only briefly and then repaid, a country steadying itself with a friend's hand and then standing on its own. Or you can read it as the latest turn of the oldest wheel, a foreign power stepping in at the exact moment the reserves went negative, the same negative reserve condition as January 89 and November 2001, the lights blazing, the rescue arriving from outside, because inside there was nothing left to defend with. The intervention was brief. The condition that required it was not new. It was the third warning light, lit again, and answered this time not by a new currency or a price freeze, but by the Treasury of the United States. The form of the rescue keeps changing. The thing that makes the rescue necessary never does. A foreign government, the most powerful on earth, stepping directly into the Argentine currency market to keep the lights from completing their sequence. I find that almost unbearably revealing, and I want to be clear about why. For 50 years, the rescues came from inside, from new currencies, from price freezes, from convertibility, from the IMF. This time the country that understood its own disease best, led by the man who understood it best. With the central gear switched off, still arrived at a place where it needed the Treasury of the United States to come in and physically buy its currency to hold the line. The most clear-eyed attempt to break the cycle in 50 years still ended up at the door of an outside power, asking for the lifeline, because the lights came on anyway. That is the third collapse, or rather that is the third running of the machine, because whether it ends in collapse or in the first real escape in 50 years is, as I am speaking, not yet known, and I am not going to lie to you and tell you which it will be. But I notice, and I want you to notice, that even the best case, the genuinely hopeful case, the case where Milei succeeds, runs through a moment where the reserves went negative and a foreign treasury bought the currency. Even success in Argentina looks like this. Even the cure runs the machine. So let me come back, finally, to the thing I told you to hold at the very beginning, because we are now standing in front of it. I said this was not really a story about Argentina. I said Argentina was the laboratory, and the experiment was larger and closer to you than you would like. Here is the experiment, stated plainly. It is the test of a single proposition. Does knowing save you? Because Argentina is the cleanest possible test of that proposition, and the result of the experiment is in, and the result is the most disturbing thing I have learnt in all of this. Argentina knew. That is the whole point. This is not a country that stumbled in the dark. This is a country with world-class economists, with a population so educated in monetary collapse that ordinary people use words like brecha and cepo and Corralito in casual conversation, that checks the blue dollar rate the way other countries check the weather. This is a country that has named every part of the machine, that commemorates its catastrophes with anniversaries and documentaries, that has the entire warning sequence burned into its collective memory across 3 generations. The economists wrote the papers. Hank published the warning 10 years early. The ministers had lived through the previous collapse with their own eyes. The people knew enough to run at the first flicker. Everyone could read the dashboard. And the lights came on anyway. Every time. Because the thing that drives the machine, the fiscal deficit, the printing, the rational flight to the dollar, the rent economy, the locked-together gears, is stronger than the thing that knows. Awareness sat in the passenger seat for 50 years, reading the warning signs out loud, naming each one as it passed, and the machine drove off the cliff regardless, because awareness was never holding the wheel. I have spent an unreasonable amount of time with this idea, and I keep trying to find the exit from it, the reassuring qualification, and I keep failing to find one that survives contact with the Argentine record. We tell ourselves a story, all of us, that knowledge is protective, that the reason terrible things happen to other people, other countries, other generations, is that they did not understand, and that we, armed with the lesson of their suffering, will not repeat it. The entire enterprise of studying history rests on that assumption, that those who learn the past are not condemned to repeat it. Argentina is the standing refutation. No country has studied this particular past more closely. No population is more fluent in the mechanics of its own ruin. They have the lesson. They have it cold. They recite it to their children. And it has not, across 50 years and 3 collapses, been enough. The reason, I have come to think, is that the things which cause the collapse are not located in the part of us that knows. They are located in the part of us that wants, that fears, that needs to be re-elected, that cannot bear to inflict the pain prevention requires, that bolts for the exit the instant the floor trembles. Knowledge lives in the mind. The machine runs on incentives, on structures, on the brute facts of who holds power and what they need to keep it, and those do not yield to being understood. You can know, with total clarity, that the deficit must be closed, and still be unable to close it, because closing it means breaking promises to people who vote, or who riot, or who simply will not stand for it, and no amount of understanding changes that arithmetic. This is the part that should disturb you more than any single number in this entire story, more than the 13 zeros, more than the 46 million%. It is the possibility that the comforting bargain at the heart of how we think about the future, the bargain that says if we are only smart enough and honest enough about the danger we can avoid it, is simply not true. That awareness and prevention are different things, housed in different parts of a society, and that the first does not reach the second. Argentina knew. It always knew. Knowing was never the thing that could have saved it. That is the deepest and worst lesson of Argentina, and it is the reason I have been telling you since the first minutes that the dashboard I would eventually ask you to look at would not be the one in Buenos Aires. Look at the lights, not the Argentine ones. The 4 signals. Capital and confidence beginning to drain from a currency, a growing distrust in the official value of the money, reserves, or in the case of a country that prints the world's reserve currency, the structural capacity to keep paying, draining toward a threshold. And the officials, the serious people, the competent managers, standing in front of the cameras saying that the fundamentals are strong and the worst is behind us. In the 2024 fiscal year, for the first time in modern history, the United States government spent more on the interest on its debt than it spent on its entire military. More than $880 billion on debt interest, against around $874 billion on defence. The interest crossed over the defence budget quietly in a single year, and most people did not notice. The historian Niall Ferguson has a phrase for that crossover. He calls it the moment any great power begins to cease being a great power, the point at which it is paying more to service its past than to defend its future. By the 2025 fiscal year, the interest figure had crossed $1 trillion for the first time in history. In October of 2025, the gross national debt of the United States passed $38 trillion, having added $1 trillion in about 71 days. Debt held by the public is now around 100% of the entire economy, the highest it has been since the year after the Second World War, and the projections. The official ones from the Congressional Budget Office and the academic ones from the National Bureau of Economic Research do not show it bending back down. They show it climbing, for decades, toward levels that have no precedent in American history. I want to give you a few more of those figures, not to alarm you for the sake of it, but because the specificity is the whole point, the same way the specificity was the point in Argentina. The National Bureau of Economic Research, in work by the economists Alan Auerbach and William Gale, projects American debt held by the public reaching something like 183% of the entire economy by the year 2054. That is not a crisis number from a collapse. That is the baseline projection, the expected path, the line on the official chart that everyone can already see. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget reported net interest of around $970 billion for the 2025 fiscal year, and the Congressional Budget Office noted that net interest on the public debt broke through $1 trillion for the first time. The gross national debt crossed $38 trillion in October of 2025 after crossing $37 trillion only about 71 days earlier. $1 trillion of new debt in a single financial quarter. These are not forecasts of a possible bad future. These are measurements of the present, and the structure underneath them rhymes with the Argentine machine in ways that are uncomfortable to say out loud. A government spending considerably more than it collects, year after year, with no realistic political path to closing the gap, because every part of the budget that could be cut has a constituency that will scream, and every tax that could be raised has a constituency that will scream louder. Promises made to the public that the arithmetic cannot keep. A political system in which the serious people understand the trajectory perfectly well and are nonetheless structurally unable to change it, because changing it requires inflicting pain that no one who wants to win an election can afford to inflict. That last sentence is the one I want you to read twice, because it is the exact sentence that describes Argentina in 1975 and in 89 and in 2001. The serious people understood the trajectory perfectly well and were structurally unable to change it. That is not a sentence about a poor country. It is a sentence about how democracies handle debts that have grown beyond the reach of ordinary politics, and it does not have a known happy ending, because the country that has run this experiment the most times has not found one in 50 years of trying. Now, I have to be careful and fair here. Because the easy thing would be to tell you that America is Argentina, and serious people disagree with that, and the disagreement matters. The United States borrows in its own currency, the dollar, which is the currency the entire world wants to hold, and that gives it room that Argentina, borrowing in a currency nobody trusts, never had. Economists at major banks and respected analysts have pushed back hard on the direct comparison, and they are not wrong to. America has advantages Argentina could only dream of. I am not telling you the United States is about to become Argentina next year, or next decade. That would be exactly the kind of false certainty I have asked you to distrust. What I am telling you is something quieter and, I think, harder to dismiss. The investor Ruchir Sharma has written that the real crisis facing the wealthy world is a fiscal crisis, and that this is what we have seen in places like Argentina, and before it, Greece, and that governments only reform when they run out of other people's money to spend. Ray Dalio, who has spent his life studying how empires rise and fall, writes now that he sees the United States and other countries heading toward the equivalent of economic heart attacks, and a Harvard economist as mainstream as Kenneth Rogoff has said his bottom line for the United States lines up with Dalio's. These are not fringe figures screaming on television. These are some of the most established voices in global finance, looking at the same dashboard, naming the same lights. And the lesson of Argentina is not that the lights guarantee the crash. The lesson of Argentina is that seeing the lights does not stop it. That is the part that should keep you awake. Not the possibility that America, or Britain, or any other heavily indebted wealthy nation cannot see what is happening to its own books. Of course it can see. The Congressional Budget Office publishes the projections. The economists write the papers. The serious people give the warnings, the same way Hankey gave his warning in 1991. The crossover where interest past defence was reported. It is all visible. It is all known. Argentina was the country that knew the most, and it did not save them. It did not save them in 1975, and it did not save them in 1989, and it did not save them in 2001, and it has not yet saved them now, even with the one leader who understood the machine completely, even with the central gear switched off, even with the treasury of the most powerful nation on earth buying pesos to hold the line. The most informed country about this specific disease on the planet has spent 50 years unable to use that information to change its fate. Because the forces driving the machine, the political promises that cannot be unmade, the spending that cannot be cut without someone screaming, the rational flight of money that produces the collapse it fears, are not problems of knowledge. They are problems of will and structure and human nature, and those have never been solved by being understood. So here is where I leave you, and I am not going to make it okay, because the whole point of Argentina is that there is no okay to make. The 13 zeros are still gone from the currency. The coin in the pocket of the man in Buenos Aires is still the survivor of 10 trillion of its ancestors. The blue dollar rate is still checked every morning by millions of people who learned, through 3 generations of ruin, that their own money cannot be trusted. And somewhere right now, in a finance ministry in a wealthy country that is absolutely certain, it is nothing like Argentina. A serious and intelligent person is looking at a chart that bends the wrong way, a chart of debt, or interest, or reserves, or confidence, and they are deciding how to describe it to the public. And they will not lie, exactly. They will say the fundamentals are strong. They will say the situation is being managed. They will say, in the particular language of their own time and place, that he who bets against us loses, that the worst is behind us, that those who deposited will receive. They will believe it when they say it. That is the thing Argentina teaches that nobody wants to learn. The man at the edge of the cliff telling the crowd there is no cliff is not a liar. He can see the same 4 lights you can see. He has read the same papers. He knows the same history. And it changes nothing, because knowing was never the thing standing between him and the edge. The lights come on in the same order, every time. Capital leaves, the gap opens, the reserves drain. And the people who can read the dashboard stand up and clear their throats and tell you that everything is fine. It was true in Buenos Aires in 1975 and in 89 and in 2001, and it is being made true again as I speak. The only question Argentina cannot answer, the only question any of them can ever answer, is whose dashboard is next, and whether the people reading it will turn out to be any different from all the people who could read it before, and could not stop and watch the lights come on, and told the crowd that everything was fine. It never was, and they always knew